The morning air in the small-town courthouse was thick with routine. Judge Alan Whitmore, a man in his early 60s with graying hair, stern features, and a commanding presence, sat high on the bench like a monarch surveying his realm. For his no-nonsense rulings and old-school views, Whitmore ruled his courtroom with a heavy hand and a deeper, often unspoken prejudice. Beneath his robe lay an unwavering belief in order, tradition, and a quiet disdain for anything or anyone that challenged his narrow worldview. On this particular day, the docket included a low-profile civil rights case involving local police misconduct. The courtroom was unusually crowded, with several community members attending to show support for the plaintiff. Among them was Darius Cole, a sharply dressed black man in his late 30s, who entered quietly and sat in the public gallery. Darius carried himself with dignity, his posture upright, eyes focused. He didn't speak, didn't fidget, just observed. As any citizen has the right to do, Judge Whitmore noticed him almost immediately. His gaze lingered longer than necessary. He narrowed his eyes, discomforted by Darius' mere presence. To him, the man didn't fit in. There was something about the way Darius sat, too confident, too composed, that irked him. As the trial progressed, Darius took out a notepad and started jotting down notes. That was all it took. Whitmore banged his gavel. "You there, sir, in the gallery. What do you think you're doing?" Darius looked up, surprised but calm. "I'm just observing, Your Honor. Taking notes. That's all." Whitmore leaned forward. "This is not a classroom. If you're not a part of this case, you have no business scribbling things down like a reporter. Put that away or leave." The room grew tense. People shifted in their seats. A few whispered. Darius replied respectfully, "I understand, sir, but I'm here in a professional capacity." Whitmore cut him off sharply. "I didn't ask for your resume. This is my courtroom, and I won't tolerate disruption. Bailiff, remove him." Gasps echoed around the courtroom. Even the attorneys looked startled. The bailiff hesitated, unsure, then approached Darius. Though clearly offended, Darius stood without resistance. As he was escorted out, he turned back once, meeting the judge's eyes not with rage, but with quiet understanding. A look that said, "You just made a mistake." The doors closed behind him. Inside, murmurs continued. The plaintiff's attorney tried to refocus on the case, but the atmosphere had shifted. Judge Whitmore regained his composure quickly, brushing off the incident. But beneath the surface, something had cracked, and imbalance had been introduced into the world he thought he controlled. He didn't realize it yet, but the man he had just dismissed wasn't some random protester or community organizer. Darius Cole had walked into that courtroom for a reason, and the judge had just given him another dot, and soon he would learn exactly who Darius was and how that single act of arrogant prejudice would upend the power he'd so comfortably wielded. For decades, the wheels of justice had begun to turn, only now they weren't in his favor. The courtroom incident didn't end when Darius Cole was escorted out. In fact, it was only the beginning. Unbeknownst to Judge Whitmore, a young woman sitting in the back of the courtroom had recorded the entire exchange on her phone. Within hours, the video had been uploaded to social media and began gaining traction. The clip showed the judge interrupting a calm, well-dressed black man, berating him without justification, and ordering his removal with no legal cause. The optics were damning. Online, outrage exploded. Civil rights activists, legal professionals, and everyday citizens condemned the judge's actions. Hashtags like #Justice for Darius and #Accountability in Court began trending. What was supposed to be a routine hearing had now become a national flashpoint for judicial misconduct and racial bias. Local news stations picked up the story, followed closely by national outlets. Commentators debated Whitmore's behavior, while legal analysts pointed out the blatant overreach. Some wondered aloud if this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. Meanwhile, Judge Whitmore remained in his chambers, largely unaware of the storm brewing outside. He had dismissed the incident in his mind, writing off Darius as an agitator trying to provoke trouble. In his view, courtrooms were not places for grandstanding, and certainly not for outsiders taking notes like they own the place. When a clerk timidly mentioned the video going viral, Whitmore scoffed. "Let them talk," he muttered. "This will blow over." They always do. But this time, it didn't. The courthouse received dozens of calls demanding the judge's resignation. Protesters began gathering peacefully outside, holding signs that read, "Equal justice for all," "Stop judicial bias," and "Darius deserved better." Despite the growing media attention, Whitmore refused to address the incident or offer an apology. Instead, he doubled down in private conversations, calling the backlash a witch hunt and just more woke nonsense. His colleagues on the bench grew nervous. A few quietly distanced themselves. Even court staff, who had long ignored or tolerated Whitmore's abrasive nature, began to question whether this time he'd gone too far. Meanwhile, Darius Cole remained out of the public eye. He gave no interviews, made no public statements, and didn't respond to media requests. His silence only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Who was this man? Why had he been there? And why wasn't he defending himself in the court of public opinion? Behind the scenes, Darius was working. Calmly, precisely. He had expected some form of resistance, but not such a public outburst from the judge. Still, the event had accelerated. His timeline. What Whitmore didn't know was that Darius hadn't come to the courtroom randomly. He had been assigned to observe it as part of a confidential internal review by the Department of Justice. The purpose? To evaluate judicial bias in small-town courts suspected of discrimination. And now, thanks to Whitmore's arrogance, that quiet observation had turned into a formal investigation. The irony was bitter. Judge Whitmore had treated Darius as beneath him, when in reality, Darius was a federal officer on assignment. The judge had kicked out the very man who would soon hold the power to decide his professional fate, and the reckoning had only just begun. Judge Alan Whitmore sat in his chambers, the rich oak furniture and heavy drapes providing a sense of timeless authority. Yet that morning he felt an unfamiliar unease. There was an envelope on his desk, stamped with the seal of the U.S. Department of Justice. Inside, a letter notified him of an immediate federal audit into the practices and procedures of his courtroom. It was signed by the Director of Judicial Oversight and Ethics, a name he didn't recognize, Darius Cole. The name rang a faint bell, but Whitmore couldn't quite place it. He assumed it was just another bureaucrat sent to harass hard-working judges in small towns. Still, the letter struck a nerve. An audit of his courtroom? He muttered under his breath about federal overreach and D.C. pencil pushers with no idea how real justice works. But his usual confidence felt thinner. His grip on control beginning to slip. Later that week, a formal meeting was scheduled. Whitmore walked into the courthouse conference room flanked by his clerk and two other court staffers. He expected some mild-mannered official, someone inexperienced, young, and easily dismissed. What he got instead was a man standing tall, calm, and professional, dressed in a dark suit. Waiting at the end of the long table. It was Darius Cole, the same man Whitmore had humiliated and kicked out of his courtroom just days earlier. For a moment, Whitmore froze. Recognition dawned, but it came too late. Darius extended a hand. "Good morning, Judge Whitmore. I'm Darius Cole, Director of Judicial Oversight. I believe we've met before briefly." The judge's hand twitched. He hesitated, then shook. it barely masking his shock. His staff exchanged uncertain glances. Darius's expression was perfectly neutral, professional, but unreadable. There was no gloating, no smugness. Just quiet confidence. It was the kind of presence Whitmore hadn't expected, especially not from someone he'd written off as just another troublemaker. Darius opened a folder and got straight to business. Our review will cover courtroom conduct, case history, sentencing disparities, and any patterns of impropriety. We'll be reviewing trial transcripts, interviewing court personnel, and speaking with members of the community. Whitmore, still reeling, tried to recover his composure. This audit is political. Let's not pretend otherwise. Darius didn't flinch. This audit is about fairness and justice, Judge. If there's nothing to hide, it should be a smooth process. The room went silent. Whitmore, for once, had no snide remark. Over the following days, Darius set up his temporary office inside. The courthouse and his team arrived lawyers, data analysts, civil rights experts. Every file, every ruling, every recorded incident was scrutinized. The judge watched helplessly as his kingdom was dissected by the very man he'd dismissed as unimportant. Whitmore tried subtle resistance, delaying paperwork, sending curt memos, making snide comments in staff meetings, but Darius never reacted emotionally. He remained composed, respectful, and focused. That unnerved the judge more than any shouting match would have. Privately, Whitmore fumed. How could he be answering to that man? But deep down, the truth was sinking in. The power dynamics had flipped. Whitmore had once held the gavel, the courtroom, and the fear of those before him. Now, he was the one being judged. And the man doing it was the one he never thought he'd have to answer to. Judge Alan Whitmore, once untouchable within the walls of his courtroom, now found himself under a microscope. What had started as a spontaneous show of arrogance, ejecting a black man he saw as an outsider, had ignited an investigation that shook the foundations of his authority. Darius Cole, now fully installed in the courthouse, wasted no time. From a makeshift office down the hall from Whitmore's chambers, he led a quiet storm of inquiry. His team, a mix of legal analysts, civil rights attorneys, and data specialists, set to work combing through every detail of Whitmore's career. Years of court records were laid out, transcripts examined, sentencing patterns analyzed. What they found wasn't surprising, at least not to Darius. There were alarming disparities. Black and Latino defendants received consistently harsher sentences for the same crimes compared to their white counterparts. Defendants from poorer neighborhoods were less likely to receive bail. In multiple cases, complaints about Whitmore's language and demeanor had been quietly buried by court administrators. The paper trail was damning. But Darius didn't rely solely on documents. He met with current and former court staff, including clerks, stenographers, public defenders, and probation officers. Many were hesitant at first. Years of silence and fear had made them cautious. But Darius had a disarming presence. He listened without judgment. He wasn't just looking for facts. He was giving people permission to speak truths long suppressed. One young court clerk, Sarah, revealed she had seen Whitmore deliberately sabotage a young black defendant's chances at early release by accidentally misplacing important paperwork. Another recalled a case where the judge mocked a Spanish-speaking defendant for needing a translator. Each story added to the growing narrative of abuse cloaked in authority. Whitmore, meanwhile, grew increasingly agitated. He stalked the hallways with the air of a caged animal. He called in favors, tried to intimidate staff, and even attempted to reach out to old political contacts for help. But no one wanted to get involved. The video, the audit, the growing public scrutiny, it was all too toxic. He was no longer the judge everyone deferred to. He was a liability. In a desperate move, Whitmore called his longtime court clerk into his office and pressured him to accidentally delete a series of old uphold his longtime court clerk into his office and pressured him to accidentally delete a series of old email correspondences with county prosecutors that hinted at collusion. The clerk, fearing he'd be caught up in the investigation, quietly reported the attempt to Darius's team. That act alone was enough to trigger an ethics violation. Darius, keeping his composure, approached Whitmore the next day with an official notice. "Judge Whitmore," he said calmly, handing over the document, "we've received credible information that you attempted to destroy potential evidence relevant to this investigation." The judge's face flushed red with anger and disbelief. "You think you can threaten me? In my courthouse?" Darius simply replied, "It's not your courthouse anymore, sir. It's the people's, and you answer to the same laws you've sworn to uphold." For the first time, Whitmore didn't respond. He just stood there, the weight of his own history pressing down on him. The investigation had become more than just an audit. It was a reckoning, and justice, long delayed, was beginning to take shape. The findings from the investigation landed like a thunderclap. Darius Cole and his team completed their comprehensive report and submitted it to the Department of Justice. Within days, it was made public. The 70-page document laid bare a disturbing pattern of judicial misconduct, racial bias, and ethical violations under Judge Alan Whitmore's long tenure. The evidence was irrefutable: statistical disparities in sentencing, inappropriate remarks in the courtroom, suppression of defendant rights, and most damning of all, an attempted cover-up during the investigation. News outlets seized on the seized on the vol, an attempted cover-up during the investigation. News outlets seized on the investigation. Story: national anchors dissected the report in primetime broadcasts. Civil rights leaders praised Darius's quiet but effective leadership. Protesters once again gathered outside the courthouse, this time with renewed energy and purpose. Signs read, "Justice for the silenced," "No one is above the law," and "Fire the judge." Whitmore was summoned to appear at a federal disciplinary hearing. The man who once held absolute power over others now stood behind a plain table, facing a tribunal of legal peers, watchdogs, and federal observers. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the transcripts later revealed a bitter, defensive figure. He blamed political agendas, claimed the report was exaggerated, and painted himself as the victim of a witch hunt. But the panel saw through his deflection. Darius didn't speak during the hearing unless directly addressed. He sat silently, composed, a symbol of the professionalism that had exposed years of injustice without ever raising his voice. His presence alone was powerful, a reminder of the moment Whitmore had misjudged him as unworthy of even being in the courtroom. The most poignant moment came when former defendants testified. One man, wrongly imprisoned for a minor drug offense, described how Whitmore sneered at him during sentencing. A Latina woman shared how the judge refused to let her speak in Spanish to describe her situation, dismissing her as incoherent. Their voices, once ignored or suppressed, now rang loudly in a room designed to hold people accountable. After days of deliberation, the panel recommended immediate suspension of Judge Whitmore pending a formal disbarment review. The courthouse staff received notice that Whitmore was to step down effective immediately. His nameplate was removed. His chambers were sealed for records auditing. For the first time in 3 decades, he no longer held a gavel or anyone's. Fear. Rattled and humiliated, Whitmore confronted Darius in a hallway after the hearing. His voice was lower, almost pleading. "Why are you doing this to me?" Darius turned, looked him in the eyes, and said quietly, I'm not doing anything to you. I'm doing what should have been done a long time ago for those you silenced." Whitmore didn't reply. His shoulders sagged slightly. In that moment, he seemed to shrink. No longer a judge, no longer an untouchable figure, but a man finally made to reckon with his actions. Outside, the community gathered for a vigil, not of mourning, but of resolve. Darius stood beside victims, families, and advocates as candles flickered against the night sky. Justice had not come in a burst of vengeance. It had come through process, truth, and persistence. And now, the system that once shielded men like Whitmore was beginning, at last, to change. With Judge Alan Whitmore suspended, a quiet but powerful shift took place in the courthouse and in the community that had long suffered under his shadow. The first time in decades, people entered the courtroom without fear of bias or dismissal. Civil rights groups and local organizations began holding open forums and legal aid workshops inside the very building that once symbolized exclusion. The same courtroom where voices had been silenced was now filled with dialogue, advocacy, and hope. Darius Cole, though not seeking public attention, was hailed as a transformative figure. The Department of Justice offered him a permanent leadership role overseeing judicial reforms across the state. After some deliberation, he accepted, not for prestige, but for purpose. Darius had seen what unchecked power looked like, and he intended to ensure that no one else wielded it like Whitmore ever again. As part of his new role, Darius launched a statewide initiative to examine other rural and underreported courts, many of which had gone years without external oversight. He pushed for transparency, diversity in hiring practices, and mandatory ethics training for judges and court staff. More importantly, he gave communities a seat at the table, forming advisory panels made up of local residents, former defendants, and civil rights leaders. Meanwhile, Whitmore retreated into silence, forced to vacate his office, stripped of his robe, and facing a looming disbarment hearing, he returned to his isolated country home. Once a man used to respect and control, he now received only mail from angry citizens, legal notices, and news clippings about the reform sparked by his downfall. He spent his days watching TV, occasionally flipping through legal journals in disbelief. One afternoon, he saw Darius on the news, speaking calmly at a public policy conference. The headline read, "Justice Reform Leader Unveils Plan to Modernize State Courts." Whitmore stared at the screen for a long moment, not in anger, but in resignation. In a rare act of introspection, Whitmore visited the now reformed courthouse late one evening. It was quiet, the halls echoing his footsteps. He passed by the courtroom and peered inside through the glass. Gone was his name. Gone were the thick drapes and dark, imposing decor. The room had been redesigned to feel open, welcoming, transparent. A mural now decorated one wall, painted by local students. A set of balanced scales surrounded by people of all backgrounds, united beneath the word justice. For a long moment, Whitmore stood there as if witnessing his own legacy crumble before his eyes. He didn't step inside. He simply turned and walked away. Back in the city, Darius continued his work. He didn't chase revenge. He didn't seek applause. His focus remained the same: to build a justice system that actually lived up to its name. The story that had begun with prejudice and injustice had ended with truth and accountability. Darius's quiet persistence had not only unseated a corrupt judge, it had inspired an entire movement for change. And somewhere deep in the silence of a courtroom once ruled by fear, justice stood taller than ever before, no longer blind, but finally wide awake.